Will the Seattle Seahawks gain 2 new Hall of Famers in 2025? What's going on, everybody? Hope you guys are doing well. We have made it to Thursday. We are just a couple days away from our first Seattle Seahawk preseason game, and we're excited. But before we get there, I want to take a little bit of a detour here. I want to pull off to the side of the road a little bit here, away from the VMAC, away from Lumen, away from all the stuff that is happening on the football field for the Seattle Seahawks right now, and talk about the Seattle Seahawks of the past a little bit, because while we're all kind of locked in on what's going to happen going forward, I don't want us to move off of the great things that happened in the past, because in the next year, there's going to be something potentially pretty cool happening for the Seahawks, and I want to talk about whether or not it's likely to happen. So, as most of you guys know, to make the NFL Hall of Fame, you have to be retired for 5 years. So that way recency bias and snap decisions and snap judgments don't overweigh what is otherwise supposed to be a very well thought out process. You don't want to just throw somebody in there and then a couple years later realize that guy shouldn't be in there. And next year, there will be 2 legendary Seattle Seahawks eligible for the Hall of Fame for the first time. They will have been retired for 5 years as of next year. And I want to talk about them a little bit, but before I get into that, thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please click the like button down below. Helps the channel out. Sub if you are new and you want daily Seahawks content. Click the bell for notifications. Consider becoming a channel member for $2 a month. Those are the best ways to help out the channel. All right, so Hall of Fame 2025. Who's on the ballot? A lot of people. There are a lot of players that are on the ballot for the first time ever in 2025. Eli Manning heads the class. I know Terrell Suggs is on there. I think Adam Vinatieri is on there. It's a good crop. And 2 of the members of the good crop are best known as members of the Seattle Seahawks. We have Marshawn Lynch, and then we have Earl Thomas. And we have this Sports Illustrated article drawing attention to that. This was written a couple of days ago by Nick Lee. And he kind of runs through the likelihood of those guys getting in on the first ballot. That's important to note. You can get in, but the voters can decide, you're not a first ballot guy, so we're not going to let you in. Come back next year, come back the year after. That's possible. But will they get in next year? So let's start with Marshawn Lynch, because I think he's the more likely one to get in. If one of these 2 guys gets in, if you come from a few years in the future and you tell me one guy gets in, the other guy doesn't, I'm going to assume it's Lynch that gets in, because Lynch became kind of an iconic player in the NFL outside just what he did on the football field, because he had such a unique personality, or some people would call it unique lack of personality. The way he interacted with the media, the way that he played, some of the plays that he had were they became a legend outside of just his production and ability on the football field in a way. And looking at Marshawn Lynch's career, I'm taking a look at what he's done overall. He is a 5-time Pro Bowler, made the Pro Bowl 5 times in his career, was All-Pro once in 2012. Had 2 years where he was leading the league in touchdown rushes, and has a Super Bowl ring. And his bulk stats are not anything spectacular. He just barely eclipsed 10,000 rushing yards in his career. He does have 85 touchdowns. That's pretty good. Has a little shy of 300 catches for 2,200 yards, 9 touchdowns receiving as well. So the bulk stats for the regular season are not necessarily jumping off the page as being Hall of Fame material. He hung around for 4 or 5 years after his prime and wasn't really that spectacular of a player at that point. Still grinded out some yards, still did some nice things, but you can definitely see why this is not a clear-cut slam dunk Hall of Famer. Now, one thing about Marshawn Lynch that might help break a tie if a voter isn't sure what to make of him would be his playoff success. Marshawn Lynch, in his career, played in 13 playoff games, ran for almost 1,000 yards and 12 touchdowns. And both those numbers put him among all-time league leaders. If you go look at rushing yards in playoff career, Marshawn Lynch is 8th. There have only been 6 guys that got over 1,000, and then you have John Riggins, and then you have Marshawn Lynch. In fact, he would be the most prolific postseason rusher to not be in the Hall of Fame if he doesn't make it, because as you can see, everybody ahead of him got in. And most of the guys behind him also got in. Once you get past Marshawn Lynch, you definitely find some guys who didn't make it, but everybody ahead of him got in. And you also have rushing touchdowns in the postseason where he's tied for 4th behind and in front of, in a few cases, some absolute legends. So postseason stats are fat. Now, if you look at this chart for a little bit, you'll quickly expose the problem with thinking about things in this way, right? Like Garrett Blount has 11 career rushing touchdowns in the playoffs, 1 less than Lynch. And we're not putting we're not putting LeGarrette Blount in the Hall of Fame. We're not putting Leonard Fournette in the Hall of Fame, and he's tied for 9th. So I'm not saying that this should be some big overarching decider, but I do think that when you take a look at his postseason achievements, the way he kind of became a little bit of a football icon beyond just being a player, because he had such a unique personality, even basically started doing commercials based off the fact that he didn't want to do commercials, right? And I'm also looking at somebody like Edgerrin James. Edgerrin James made the Hall of Fame, right? Edgerrin James got in. Edgerrin James does have better stats, volume stats. He was a much more prolific receiver. He has about 2,000 more rushing yards. And he did play a little bit more, and he had a little bit more of a full career, I guess you could say. But he made 4 Pro Bowls, 1 All-Pro, no Super Bowl rings. Playoff stats are not as good as Marshawn's. And overall, when I try to make that comparison, I understand that Edge put up some legendary numbers, like we're talking almost 1,600 yards from scrimmage in the regular season alone. I feel like Marshawn Lynch was able to kind of surpass Edgerrin James in terms of NFL legacy by the time he retired. The Super Bowl ring matters. The extra Pro Bowl matters. The added playoff production compared to Edgerrin James matters. And at a certain point, I think that starts to outweigh things, especially when I think there's also something to be said for the fact that Edgerrin James spent most of his career on one of the most loaded offenses of all time. He had an easy job. He got to play with Peyton Manning, Marvin Harrison, Reggie Wayne, Dallas Clark even. And I know Dallas Clark isn't a legendary player, but Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne were 2 of the best receivers of that era. Peyton Manning was one of the best quarterbacks in NFL history. So his job was easy. Marshawn Lynch spent time in Buffalo with a random assortment of quarterbacks. They had, Trent Edwards for a little bit. He spent time in Seattle with, eventually Russell Wilson, but Wilson had his best years mostly when Lynch was on the way out the door. Like, he played with young Russell Wilson. He played with rookie Russell Wilson. He played with Tavares Jackson. He played with Charlie Whitehurst. So, to me, big picture, if you put him in, put the other guy in. I don't know if that's the right way to look at things, but I think that if Edge gets in, Marshawn gets in. Now, here's the thing. Marshawn Lynch had a little bit of a combative relationship with the media. We all know about that. He didn't really like answering questions. He didn't like talking. And the media tends to punish players that don't play along. The media tends to look at that and go, okay, you don't want to help me out, I'm not going to help you out. And usually, if the player is good enough, eventually they get in anyway. But sometimes they get punished by not getting let in as soon as they should be, right? Like a guy like a Michael Irvin. Now, I'm not comparing the situations between the two as being equivalent, but Michael Irvin retired as one of the greatest receivers in NFL history. They kept him out of the Hall of Fame for 2 years because of some of his off-the-field stuff. It was like a punishment. So I suspect that Lynch will get quote-unquote punished in the same way, but he gets in eventually. Maybe it takes a couple years. Maybe it takes a slower year where there isn't quite as much going on. Maybe he kind of sneaks in there in like 4 years when there's just not enough on the ballot to distract from him enough. But I'm pretty confident he gets in eventually. Just don't feel like it's going to be the first year, first year of eligibility. Love it. I think that he would deserve it. I think that if Edge gets in, you got to put Lynch in. But feel like they're going to hold him out for just a little while. Second guy, Earl Thomas. This one is tougher. And it's tougher because of off-the-field stuff. In the case of Earl Thomas, while what Marshawn did was kind of endearing, while what Marshawn did was ultimately harmless, I'm not saying that some media people won't be offended by the way Marshawn did things, but it was harmless. Even media people, I think, would agree. Earl Thomas actually really ruined and damaged and sullied his reputation at the end of his career. But before we get to that, the player Earl Thomas. All right? 7-time Pro Bowler, 3-time All-Pro, generally considered to be the best safety of his generation. What he did goes beyond stats. Like, there are some really impressive stats with Earl Thomas, but the stats don't even really uncover it the way it needs to be uncovered, because Earl Thomas took away that deep zone like few players in NFL history have been able to do, and made everything in front of him work. In my opinion, if you look at those prime LOB years, which was 2012 to 2015, those 4 straight #1 defenses, Earl was the most valuable and irreplaceable commodity on that defense. I think he was more important than Sherman, more important than Chancellor, more important than Wagner, more important than Bennett, more important than Averill, KJ, anybody else you could care to name. I would take Earl over all of them because his ability to patrol the deep zone and make it virtually impossible for the defense to get attacked over the top, irreplaceable. And when I look at that and I filter things through that lens, there's no one else I'd rather have. Everybody else, it would be really hard to replace Sherman. It would be really hard to replace Wagner. But I think that it's easier to do that than Earl. So theoretically, he should get in easily, right? I actually think that he, as a player, might be more deserving of a Hall of Fame spot than even Marshawn Lynch. But a little bit harder for a safety. His greatest value is in what didn't happen on the football field, right? Because he was never some monster interception hawk. He's not Ed Reed. Ed Reed had 9, 10 interceptions once or twice in his career. He was a absolute takeaway machine. Earl wasn't that. Earl's value was teams didn't even want to throw the ball at him because they knew what he was going to do if they did. So that doesn't show up in stats. And at the end of the day, his career just fizzled out. He went to Baltimore, had a really good year for a really good team, made the Pro Bowl, was on a team that was probably going to compete for Super Bowls over the next couple years at the time, we thought. I know they really haven't, but at the time you certainly would have thought so. And he did stuff and got kicked off the team and nobody wanted to touch him. And I understand how rare that is, by the way. Players stick up for players. In the NFL, players stick up for players. Like Michael Vick, all the stuff he did, his teammates still stood up for him even after he got kicked out the league. Right? Players do really bad things and their teammates will stand up for them and their guys will stand up for them. I didn't see anybody stand up for Earl Thomas. That's how negatively what he did was viewed by those guys. So by the time he retired, it seemed ridiculous to even think he was going to make the Hall of Fame. But now we're 5 years away from it. Now we can have the conversation. And as a player, I think there's no doubt he should get in. By the way, I didn't mention the fact that he has a Super Bowl ring, although I think if you're watching this video, you know that. So It's just a matter of the off-the-field stuff. And his off-the-field stuff was, like, weird. It wasn't even, like, just straight up, like, wrong, like he committed a crime, or he just did something inappropriate, or he said something rude. I mean, I know that he did do some rude things when he was here, don't get me wrong, and I know he left on really bad terms, and the way he handled things on the way out was bad. I'm not denying that at all. But what he did was so bizarre. If he got knocked out of the average NFL fan's consciousness so fast. This was the best safety of his generation, and he got wiped off the face of the earth so quickly. I'm still kind of crazy that a guy this good could go that way. And let me say this. Let me say this about Earl as a comp to another safety, Darren Woodson. Darren Woodson has not made the Hall of Fame. Darren Woodson, I don't know if you would call him the safety of his generation. There were probably a couple guys who were considered to be a little bit better in the 90s, but Darren Woodson made 5 Pro Bowls, made 3 All-Pro teams, and won 3 Super Bowls. Won 3 Super Bowls with the Cowboys. One of those Super Bowls he didn't play that much, I guess, but he's a 3-time Super Bowl winner. So I'm looking at this. I'm looking at the fact that this guy actually has more playoff interceptions than Earl. I'm looking at the fact that he played in way more playoff games than Earl. He played his whole career on one team. He didn't do anything drastic to ruin his reputation on his way out of the league. He had a full career before he retired. By the time he retired, he was pretty much out of gas. I mean, he came back in 2003 and played a season. That's how much this guy liked football, just to give you an idea there. Or, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong column there. But he played until 2003. Earl probably could have played another 3-4 years at a really high level, and he didn't because of the stuff that happened in the offseason after 2019, where I don't even want to sit here and recap all the stuff he got into, but it was weird. It was bad, and you get what you get, right? You get the result that you get. A guy who retires after his Pro Bowl caliber season where he's only 30 years old. So this one's tough. As a player, of course he gets in. Probably should be first ballot. He's the best safety of his generation. He's the best safety of the 2010s. But I feel like the media is going to hold him out. And they could hold him out a long time. I could see a situation where Earl doesn't get in until, like, people have just forgotten about that stuff. So I don't think it's going to be first ballot for Earl. I'm going to say he gets in eventually. Like, by eventually, I mean it could be decades. All right, let me know what you guys think about these two, however. See you guys later. Go Hawks. Just wanted to play around with this stuff because it is fun. And even though it wasn't always perfect with them, I do have a lot of love for these guys. They gave a lot of good memories. All right, see you guys later. Go Hawks.